الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا محمد عبده ورسوله. The Chinese curse, of course, was always, may you live in interesting times, and generally we sympathize with that. There was even a Spanish way of bidding farewell to people in a friendly way. Que no haya novedad, may no new thing arise. That's how humanity used to be. We liked things the way they were. We knew that the past was probably better, and we thought that any substantial changes were likely to disturb our equilibrium in society, in government, and in our souls. Nowadays, we live in a time where everything is the exact reverse of that. Nobody is particularly interested in truth or beauty any longer. Instead, the cutting edge of our culture is always what's new, what's innovative, what challenges our established perceptions. Take a look at the National Gallery, and then go over the river and look at Tate Modern, and you'll see how our sensibilities have been turned on their heads. Ours is a culture that isn't about truth. It isn't about beauty. It's more or less given up on those things, but it is about finding new things all the time. And as believers in this very strange kind of situation, we are wrong-footed and puzzled. As believers in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we've always looked back to a golden age which we knew existed, which was the time of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We know that perfection is possible because it has existed and it has walked this earth. Modernity says perfection is there somewhere in the future and we can't really imagine what it would look like. Our reality is unimaginable to the people of 100 years ago, let alone the people of 1,000 years ago, and it's a reasonable bet that our great-grandchildren's reality will be unimaginable to our realities now, and the process is constantly accelerating. So as believers who like to look back and who love what they see when they look back, we find the modern world very peculiar. Everything is challenging us, and many of those things that challenge us most are the things that seem to be about things that we were once most certain about. Current events seem to be coming closer and closer to our hearts. There is something elemental about the destruction of Baghdad, once the symbol of Muslim intellectual and political and economic leadership of the world. There is something elemental also about the situation in the Holy Land and in Palestine, and it tugs at our hearts not just because of the suffering of the people who are there now, but because of what this seems to represent and the challenge that it represents to our certainties. What is our image of history? Our image is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala vindicated, in perhaps the greatest surprise in history, the line of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, and made the outcast into the victors. And from the Haram in Mecca, there was a spiritual victory which led to the Haram in Jerusalem, shortly to be followed in the time of the Khulafa by the physical victory, which united all three holy cities. There was something for our imagination profoundly right about the existence of the Dome of the Rock. What could be more glorious as a culmination of the manifestly legible purposes of heaven in history than that beautiful golden crown? That's the place where the ancient prophets alayhim wassalam worshipped. That's the place where Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam taught and worshipped. That's the place where Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam went and worshipped, leading and affirming all of the earlier prophets in prayer before he went on that final unimaginable solo voyage. What could be more appropriate than the Dome of the Rock as the crown of all history? That was the Muslim assurance, shaken but not overthrown by the Crusader interlude, threatened but not destroyed by the armies of Hulagu and the Mongols, threatened but not destroyed by the British occupation, but now apparently facing unprecedented hazards. So fundamental is the symbol of that structure and what it represents. our culmination of monotheistic history, that we feel that what's happening in the Holy Land now is not comparable to what is happening in so many other troubled places in this troubled age. What happens there has to be not just different and more important, but also more meaningful. And because that is a place where so much sacred history has unfolded, whose meaning is often discernible only millennia afterwards, we struggle to discern the meaning of this current episode. What does the situation in Palestine mean? If we take a step back from the immediate coverage of the humanitarian catastrophes and the political shenanigans, what does it actually mean? Well, what it means is, firstly, the vindication of the outcast, Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, the outcast son, finally vindicated, showing where Allah is, in other words, with the broken-hearted, with the ethnically impure, with those who are rejected by a powerful narrative of centrality and exclusion. The rejected son turns out to be the one who is finally to be chosen. But what it seems to represent to ourselves is that time is being turned back. Just as so much of modernity is about looking forward to a time which we vaguely assume and hope is going to be better, there's something retrograde about the current history and situation of Palestine and the Holy Land. How could it be if there's a progression of prophecy, not a progression of the content of prophecy, but in terms of the immenseness of the reach of the message from the time of the earliest Hebrew prophets down to the time of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam and his larger message, and finally the message of the Ishmaelite prophet Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, which becomes the center of this extraordinary political and cultural zone that unites East and West, that brings together the Persian world with the Eastern Mediterranean world, with the North African world, that is an obvious progression which we can understand. Now the custodians of that city seem to be the people who reject that image of history. The people who say there have been two drastic wrong turnings, the alleged messianic event and the alleged sealing of prophecy. And we struggle to understand why this should be the case. Why are the current custodians of some of our holiest places the people whose ideology seems to be based, as far as we can discern, on an explicit rejection of the claims of the two most recent prophetic founders? What's going on? Has history gone wrong? We start to panic and we start to worry and we start to doubt, and that has a lot to do with the kind of gut reaction that we see amongst many Muslims. But what's really going on? Well, let's wind the history back a little bit and consider, focusing on the history of the city of Gaza, the city of Palestine that has been most in the news of late, a kind of icon of Ishmaelite suffering at the hands of unfeeling oppressors. The history of Gaza turns out to be an interesting sign of what Islam has accomplished in the region. A city that was very slow to Christianize, and that eventually had to be Christianized effectively by force. St. Porphyry, at the beginning of the 5th century, was so impatient with the reluctance of the population to accept baptism that he led his monks on a campaign to physically destroy the pagan temples and to rough up the pagan priests. And his church, the Church of Porphyry, is still there, and it's still a church. He's the Christian patron saint of the city. The Byzantine empress, when she heard that the city had finally been forcibly Christianized, celebrated by sending 2,000 gold coins to the city in order to turn the main pagan temple into a church, the Eudoxiana, glorious church. But that episode only lasted for less than 200 years, because at the beginning of the 7th century, the Ishmaelites, the outcasts, the ethnically impure, the rejected, appear in order to overthrow the pretensions and the cruelties of Christianized Rome. It was one of the fastest episodes of conversion that the ancient world has ever seen. The same people who were so stubborn to accept Christianity became Muslim almost overnight. The Greek Christian population went to Sayyidina Omar radiallahu an and asked him for permission to transform the Eudoxiana church into a mosque. And it's a mosque to this day. It's the Jami' Omar the mosque of Omar ibn al-Khattab. Has been ever since, except for the short Crusader interlude when it was turned over to Catholic worship. Imam al-Shafi'i, rahmatullahi alayhi, was from the city of Gaza. It produced so many great ones in the history of this ummah. The Ottoman Empire, it flourished. And it flourished until the dawn of our current calamity and our current puzzlement. In 1917, the 3 battles of Gaza splashed across our headlines at the time, but we have profoundly forgotten them. What were the battles of Gaza? The first 2 were between the British forces and the Ottoman forces. The Ottoman forces fighting for the Khalifa of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and the British fighting for imperial glory. And the first 2 battles were won by the forces of the Khilafah, and General Allenby was soundly defeated. The third battle was different. The third battle introduced the principle that has characterized the tragedy of the region ever since. The tragedy of insincerity, double standards, hypocrisy, backstabbing, and treason. The reason why the caliphal forces crumpled and were defeated in the region, having held them triumphantly for so many centuries against all comers, was not because they were incapable of dealing with these external enemies. They defeated the British at Gallipoli. Great humiliation. The greatest humiliation in the career of Winston Churchill was his defeat at Gallipoli. Despite all of the suffering that the empire had experienced, they could still defeat the British Empire, and the imperial troops were routed on the beaches of Gallipoli. They were doing the same at Gaza, and then something unprecedented in the history of Islam took place. And what was that unprecedented event? The great treason, al-Khiyanat al-Kubra. Who was it who was fighting alongside the British? In the propaganda portraits of the time, the British Tommy with his solar helmet, with the machine gun, the Lewis gun, pointed at the distant Turkish lines, and you can just about see the Tarbushis and the Ottoman army there. Who is feeding the bullets into the machine gun? It is the local Arab ally. That's the great treason. The uprising of Arab nationalists against the Khalifa of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam for the sake of British promises and British gold and the opportunity to sack Damascus. If you look at the pages of history in any civilization, you will be hard put to find a comparable act of treason. That is why the third battle of Gaza did not go our way, and why the story of the city ever since has been a story not of prosperity under a united Islamic realm, but of division, partition, occupation, and now catastrophe at the hands of a merciless, powerful oppressor. The obvious moral lesson for that is be united. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold fast altogether to the rope of Allah. At that most critical point of the history of the Ummah, one section of the Ummah, the Arab nationalist cause decided to change sides, to cross the lines and to fight for Whitehall against Istanbul. In our vision of history, that must be important, and perhaps that treachery, that insincerity, that hypocrisy lies at the spiritual heart of this rotten situation. Maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is still angry with those people. So colossal was that betrayal, and so absolute was their rejection of the idea that they might even acknowledge that they made a mistake, that those people have been subjected to punishment after punishment after punishment. Not just the Palestinian people, but the people of the region more generally. Each one of the national stories of those new nations that so bravely, in their nationalistic, Arab nationalistic way, arose following the decline of imperial rule, has been more or less a shabby catastrophe. Scoundrels in uniforms, scoundrels with crowns, scoundrels wherever you look. The catastrophe of a people who don't seem to deserve that kind of torment. And it seems to become worse and worse. Perhaps if we do look at the history a little bit and look at the origins of this, then we can begin to do two things. First, we can pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness for the people of the region. And secondly, we can start to reorient our thinking, recognizing that the secular alternative, the banner of Arabdom in this case, but there was also banners of Turkish nationalism that soon came, banners of Iranian nationalism, banners of Pakistani nationalism, all of these new forms of Jahiliyyah have actually not delivered even on their own terms. Look at the states of the modern Middle East. Each one of them is, by any standards, a failure. Political failure, an ethical failure, an economic failure, military failure, diplomatic failure. Completely helpless, the laughingstock of the world.